Ecological restoration is human-led, nature-enabled. So in other words, it's us using nature-based approaches to achieve a particular outcome. And if that's restoration of coral reef or it's river restoration or whatever, we're using nature-based solutions to achieve a particular desired outcome. Rewilding flips that on its head, and we say that rewilding is nature-led, human-enabled. So it's nature determining its own ecological trajectory, and it's us having the humility and the foresight to actually give it the space and indeed the time to allow it to do that. So we don't have a set outcome from rewilding. It's an open-ended process in that respect.
You're listening to the Rewilding Earth podcast. I'm your host, Jack Humphrey. What does rewilding mean on a global scale? And how do we implement rewilding projects across a wide variety of different geographic, cultural, and political constraints? To guide us through this intricate landscape is Dr. Steve Carver, a professor from the University of Leeds School of Geography and the co-chair of IUCN's Rewilding Thematic Group. For nearly a decade, Steve and his colleagues have led a global effort on behalf of the IUCN to define what rewilding actually is. The result is a landmark paper, Guiding Principles for Rewilding and Conservation Biology, and the new comprehensive IUCN guidelines. It's a discussion about scale, connectivity, coexistence, and the ultimate hopeful future of wildness. We begin with Steve giving us some background to lay the foundation for today's conversation.
We produced a paper back in 2021, which has got quite a lot of traction. It was called Guiding Principles for Rewilding and Conservation Biology. And there's some big names on that paper, not just in Europe, North America, but elsewhere. Yeah, that set out 10 guiding principles for rewilding and a definition. And it came off the back of a request from the IUCN, the International Union for the Conservation of Nature, and that's made up of a series of pillars. And it was the Commission for Ecosystem Management that asked us to set up a rewilding task force to really kind of bottom out what rewilding is about. Come up with an attempt, anyway, at least at a unifying definition and a set of guiding principles. And so that's what we did. That was based around a survey of some of the leading names, thinkers on rewilding and pioneers, a survey of the principles that had been already written down by a bunch of organizations that were doing rewilding, and then a whole series of workshops. And I think we reached out to well over 100 people and organizations in coming up with the definition and the principles. And that's kind of rolled over into the document that was published last month at the World Conservation Congress in Abu Dhabi, which is this guidelines for rewilding document. So yeah, it's been a long time coming. It's kind of 8 years in the making. We're now a rewilding thematic group, so we're now permanent. And before we lose sight of the fact, I'm here with you today, which is great, but there's a whole bunch of other people behind this. My colleagues in the core group of the Rewilding thematic group, but all of the people that have contributed. I'm just a secretary in many senses of the word. I get my name on the paper first.
You're too humble. And the first question that I really have from that is, how would you characterize the need for guidelines? Was it that chaotic before we started to organize ourselves internationally around rewilding? Because in North America, we thought we had it pretty well defined, but it was a very North American rewilding at the same time. Bringing up differences between different countries gets confusing.
Yeah, to be honest, I think you probably did nail down the ecological principles pretty well. But I think what we need to recognize is that, rewilding is very much place-based and a participatory outlook on approaches to conservation. And, and I think that's what changes as you move it around the world. We've written, papers about comparing and contrasting North America with Europe, for example. I'm sat in Yorkshire, England, and it's a very different thing. Yes, the ecological principles are, uniform. They apply wherever you are. However, it's how you then apply those where you've got to be cognizant of the fact that different cultures, different legal systems, all of that will mean big differences in how it's actually implemented and applied.
It was a tough task, I would imagine.
It's tricky, yeah. I mean, inevitably we've had to generalize, but going back to what your comment about, it was a bit chaotic in terms of how then rewilding as a concept and as an approach was then being applied in different situations globally. A lot of people say, well, what is it? And Dolly Jorgensen wrote a quite an influential paper back in 2015, and called rewilding a plastic term. It became molded to whatever people wanted it to be. Okay, we've got this kind of general idea of ecological, giving as we call it, giving nature the space and the time to determine its own ecological trajectory. But that comes with some baggage depending on where you are in the world. We say it's got to be context specific.
What would you say is the single most important principle that policymakers and the public, wherever they are in the world, need to understand from this work?
Well, as I think it's the fact that rewilding is nature led. It's about functional ecological restoration, and it's about scale as well. We aspire when we're looking at rewilding to think about large scale restoration through landscape scale planning. And that, then brings in some of these political issues about land ownership and land management and collaboration across, large areas. And a lot of people, particularly in Europe and particularly in the UK, are doing very small scale stuff. And I think it's just that realization that, what we're talking about here is large scale, giving space back to nature. And, if you forget that, then you're somehow missing the point with rewilding.
You deal a lot in space, you do a lot of mapping work, and that's what you were well known for before you took on this project. And that's an issue when you start mixing in the politics, land ownership, and everything else. When you hear people talk about 30 by 30 and 50 by 50 and these very, very lofty goals, considering also the global political climate seems to be tending away from what we would like it to do in order to hit those goals. That combined with the space and everything else, I mean, that's the GIS thing, right?
Yeah, that's right. Yeah, I've been chewing away at the problem of identifying and defining and modeling wilderness quality, wilderness character for many years now. And it just seemed a natural progression to move into looking at opportunities for rewilding in terms of, you're right, the UN's Global Biodiversity Forum, Kunming-Montreal Agreement has this, these 30% targets, the 30 by 30 vision. One that I think it's target 2 says we've got to restore, and if you want to call that rewilding, but restore 30% of degraded land, sea, and water across the planet. And then there's target 3, which says, protect 30% of land, sea, and water for high biodiversity nature. And that's, those are great targets, and not quite the 50% of Nature Needs Half or Half Earth projects, but they're good starting points. And the target for this is 2030. So that's less than 5 years away. And it's tricky to see how we might reach those. But as a geographer, the question I always have is, great, but where? It's easy for large countries with large areas of pretty empty. I'm talking about empty as in terms of human terms, landscapes like Canada or whatever. To I think using a European example, the Scandi states, so Norway, Finland, Sweden, Iceland, very easy for them to identify 30%. but it's a tricky proposition for some of the smaller, more densely populated countries like England or Belgium or the other lowland countries in Europe. I think a better approach would be to look at it in terms of biomes, ecological areas across whichever region we're looking at. And so we wrote a paper for the World Wilderness Congress last year, where we'd already mapped wilderness quality in Europe, version 2 of that, across continental Europe. And we started to sort of slice it up based on these 30 by 30 targets and say, well, where is the top 30% wildest landscape in Europe? And if we were thinking about targeting areas for rewilding, that might seem reasonable. However, it's very biased towards the high altitude, high latitude areas if you do that.
Rocks and ice, Dave called it.
Absolutely, as you would expect. So that's kind of missing the point. I mean, but we sliced it up politically as well. So we also said, okay, where's the top 30% on a country by country basis? And of course, in doing that, you've got a lot of smallish countries in Europe. You suddenly increase the area, which, if you're taking the total area of Europe, suddenly increase the area somewhat that's covered by these 30 by 30 targets. But then you think, well, actually, this is missing the point entirely, is where I think it was Leopold that said, the first rule of intelligent tinkering is, keep all of the parts.
Mm-hmm.
And as somebody who tinkers with old British motorcycles, I fully ascribe to that mantra. So why not look for the top 30% on a, sort of European biome level? And then you get a really interesting image out, which I think is a more, ecologically sound way forward. Of course, you then come back to the problems of political geographies, because a lot of these areas, you're dealing with transboundary conservation, of course.
Yeah.
You've got the tricky issue of how you coordinate across national boundaries, international boundaries, to achieve those aims. And, as we started talking about there, the world is not a particularly, a place where everybody's speaking on singing from the same hymn sheet at the moment, politically speaking, at least.
Yeah. It does seem like a club, just hitting something over the head with we just need 30%. When you bring up the biomes and there are places, I mean, you could get to 30% in Nevada, of the state. And that 30% would do next to nothing for, biological diversity compared to going to all the hot spots.
Yeah.
I wonder, and this is a huge problem for you map guys, because when you get on audio podcasts, the very best thing that you can do to demonstrate your work is show a map.
Look at this picture. Yeah.
But you've also been aware of this problem for quite some time, and it's probably made you really good at explaining what you're saying, what you'd otherwise be seeing. Like, I'm really interested in, what would an overlay look like when you went from just 30% to the biomes? How did those two maps look different?
Well, as I say, the original map looked, like we were looking at the northern climes and the high altitude areas. There's very strong altitudinal and latitudinal bias to the top 30% in Europe, if you take Europe as a whole. So you've got all of the northern areas of northern Finland and Norway and Sweden and Iceland very well represented. And, northern areas, of course, we included Russia up to the Urals. And all of the high altitude areas are nicely represented. So the Alps, the Pyrenees, the Carpathians, etc. As soon as you change that to country level, you still see that in microcosm. So it's the high altitude, high latitude areas where, those countries are represented as standing out. But then you see some very broken, fragmented patterns in countries which are low-lying, relatively highly populated, densely populated, countries like Belgium and things, very sort of fragmented pattern. As soon as you then sort of think, well, okay, let's identify the top 30% via biome, then the pattern changes again entirely. Yes, you've still got those, well, if you think about it, those classic school atlas images of all of the world's different biomes. then you start seeing, the top 30% within those. And that's when it starts to get interesting. And it's really tricky to describe without having a map in front of us. But it's problematic. And of course, the problem with that is that all of the areas where we as humans have been able to exploit, particularly for agriculture, but also laterally for forestry and for fisheries and for other natural resources, those have been, heavily exploited. So the lowland, savanna, and temperate woodland landscapes, all of them have been easy to occupy and to exploit. If you're thinking about human appropriation of net primary productivity, that's, the stuff that we can extract from essentially soil and other resources where we've been able to grow food. And so wild areas are immensely underrepresented in the fertile areas, the areas which are easy to farm and to settle. And so that's why that image looking at the top 30% of the different biomes is quite interesting, particularly when you look at those biomes where we've been able to, easily farm and to settle.
It's somewhat predictable. I mean, I don't think that you probably were too surprised by the results of looking at it that way, but it's also sad because it puts rewilding on that map in that context. It puts rewilding in direct opposition to human progress. It's like we take all the good stuff and we're like, where's all the good stuff? And it's like, well, you're standing on where it formerly existed. And that's the case probably with these maps is they show very clearly that problem.
Yeah, and I say that's why when you get into those landscapes where we have appropriated that productivity for growing food, and don't get me wrong, we need to feed ourselves. So when people quite often round on me say, "Oh, you want to rewild everywhere?" I said, "No, we don't. I'm as fond of some food as the next person." So it's a question of going back to the 30%. It's where appropriate and where possible, but it is. As you say, it's kind of sad that it's going to be really difficult to think about rewilding and giving nature some space back in those areas which are easily farmed or more productive land. So if you just take the UK, for example, a lot of our rewilding efforts are really focused on the low-grade agricultural land. Like the US, we have a land capability system, which, puts grade 1 agricultural land, which is great for growing high value horticultural products, fruit and veggies, for example. And grade 2 land's great for arable, for growing grain crops. Grade 3 is great for grazing, for milk production and beef cattle, etc. Grade 4, you start to get into marginal land where, production is largely dependent on government subsidies for it to turn a profit. And then grade 5, grade 6, you can't really do much on that except a bit of forestry, a bit of kind of rough grazing and recreation. So it naturally, rewilding finds its home in some of these more marginal landscapes. And that just makes it really fragmented and difficult to see how you can maintain connectivity in a representative set of ecosystems across a continent like Europe, or indeed the US, for example, where much of the productive land has fallen under the hoof and the plow.
Which I think it's pretty obvious why we needed to add another C to the 3 Cs, and that is coexistence, because I don't see how you get to rewilding goals in these very tight, delicate areas and situations and cultures and politics without a really big focus on coexistence.
Yeah, and that's where we need that really big shared vision and common set of principles at a global level. It's and I just don't see that happening, unfortunately. I don't want to be pessimistic, but I see a lot of good stuff going on at a sort of an individual country level and individual, philanthropic type projects and what have you, but I just don't see that global cooperation what's necessary to produce these big wins. The shared vision, set of common principles, which we've got now, but do you see those being applied at a global level? Well, yeah, I can't see that at the moment. Don't get me wrong. Again, there are some good projects out there, like the Global Rewilding Alliance, pushing on this door. But yeah, it is a tool for global sustainability, and if we get it right, then I see there's hope. But if we don't, and I know money makes the world go round, but it's also a great source of inertia for any of this kind of forward thinking.
It's also not made any easier by rewilding being such a popular term that people are using it for gut biome,
Yeah.
ebook sales, men beating their chests and playing drums in the woods, and calling it
Racehorses.
Yes.
Yes. Remember the racehorse called rewilding?
I mean, it is a fantastic word. It's one of the best words that humanity has ever come up with. But yeah, it is and that's why I wanted to talk to you, because you are part of a team that tried to make sense of it all, and in a way that would make it make sense as best possible for anyone trying to understand how they might implement something in their country, in their city, in their town, anywhere in the world. And not a small task. And so why do you think, is this still just way up in the clouds? Like, you released all of this stuff, it's still being kind of discussed at a high level and everything. How does it fall from where it is to the ground and start to become maybe a messily applied factor in how people do rewilding in their area?
Yeah. Well, I think, going back to that, the comment I made about Dolly Jorgensen's paper about it being a plastic term, I think this, the work that we've done has tried to, kind of solidify that and remove some of that undue flexibility in what is and isn't rewilding. And so I think having a unifying definition, which is kind of wordy, but it necessarily had to be, and a set of principles of which, projects, individuals, organizations can go down a list of principles and go tick, tick, maybe not, or yeah, we aspire to that particular principle, but we're not there yet. I think having those set of principles and a series of guidelines enables people to think, is what I'm doing rewilding, or is it something else? And, if it's regenerative agriculture or if it's more traditional ecological restoration, there's nothing wrong with that. I think, conservation needs a spectrum of approaches, but, let's be clear as to what rewilding is. Yeah, it's nice for people to say, well, I'm rewilding my gut biome by eating soil or whatever. I probably did that as a kid. You probably did as well. But, when we're talking about it as a conservation approach, I think we need to be pretty clear as to what that is. And I mean, yes, it's a great word in some respects in that it's got the public imagination. It's also wound some people up as well. It's not universally liked. And to be honest, I'm not awfully keen on it, because the rebit has been a bit of a hostage to fortune. And a lot of people say, oh, we can't turn the clock back, 2,000 years or whatever. I said, well, that's not what it's really about. It's a forward-looking approach. So, maybe wilding or nature-led ecosystems or whatever, I don't know. But, when we came up with a sort of a simple model which explains the distinction between ecological restoration and rewilding, in that we say that ecological restoration is human-led, nature-enabled. So, in other words, it's us using nature-based approaches to achieve a particular outcome. And if that's restoration of coral reef or it's river restoration or whatever, we're using nature-based solutions to achieve a particular desired outcome. Rewilding flips that on its head, and we say that rewilding is nature-led, human-enabled. So it's nature determining its own ecological trajectory, and it's us having the humility and the foresight to actually give it the space and indeed the time to allow it to do that. So we don't have a set outcome from rewilding. It's kind of it's an open-ended process in that respect.
You scientists hate those things. Those are not conducive to, but it's just really hard to, you want it to mean what you just said, without saying what you just said, if just one word could do that. And then there was a lot of fighting. There's fighting constantly to this day over the idea of wilderness, whether something's wilderness, can be wild. What are you talking about? Pre-industrial, all of those arguments. And I saw the same arguments over rewilding. And then the whole move to say, well, let's come up with something else that makes that happen. And so I don't know. I think that speaks of wildness in our language, in our ability to communicate.
But I'll quote Tony Sinclair here, and he said that if a thing, be it restoration or rewilding, a term rather, applies to everything, then it also means nothing.
Right.
So we can't call everything rewilding, even if we are, And there's a particular famous rewilding project that calls itself a rewilding project in the UK. And they wrote a big book recently called The Book of Wilding. And in there they said, you can even rewild your window box, I think, well, no, you can't, It's, I think that's taking things to a silly extreme. It needs to happen at scale. It needs to be connected. It needs to be nature-led, all of those things. But as I said earlier, it's not the only solution. I think there's a room for traditional conservation. There's a room for ecological restoration. There's room for high nature value farming, as we call it, or regenerative agriculture. Mm-hmm. All of those things have a place, and that's where we come back to that question about it being place-based and participatory. These things happen in space and time, particular location. And that gives it context, be that political or cultural or geographical or, ecological context. And rewilding needs to be cognizant of all of those things and only apply rewilding and the rewilding term where it is appropriate to do so.
So what if an organization who will remain anonymous gets lots and lots of emails from people who don't understand what you're talking about here today, the scale, the scope, the principles of rewilding, and they have just inherited 75 acres, and they don't want to do what their parents did with it. They want to rewild it. Maybe 75 acres fits in the plan, but some people also write us about backyard level stuff, which sort of screams the window box thing a little bit.
A little bit.
Yeah,
but if everybody did it, then there would be economies of scale. Those 100,000, million backyards, whatever, all doing, kind of rewilding things. So instead of applying the glyphosate and weeding out everything all of the time, then letting nature take its course a little bit more. And I do that in my tiny little bit of the UK. I don't cut my lawn. And until my wife starts nagging me, you really ought to cut that because it's starting to look too messy. So I'll cut it maybe twice a year now. But I wouldn't call it rewilding. It's great for the pollinators and maybe some of the local wildlife. But it's not really rewilding. But if everybody did it, then
it would be. One of the biggest growth sectors in America is the American lawn, and it's like 40 million acres. Total under a foreign invasive species with absolutely no biological diversity whatsoever. And it's basically peer pressure from our ancestors. Dead people are still telling us we need to have green manicured lawns, and practically everyone is listening to that old, outdated advice. And while they begrudgingly go out every week and mow it, they don't even want to, and use all of their water to keep it watered. And so, that's a real patchwork. We can't get more patchy than just neighborhood backyards. And at the same time, if birds can jump from place to place and there are enough of those little places to get them along their way on their vast migration route, that has to mean something if you could develop a movement around it.
Yeah. The biodiversity gains would be great. Well, it could be massive. Going back to your 75 acres, there's nothing wrong with doing, I'd love 75 acres, thank you very much, and I'd do something similar. But again, it's about where that sits in the wider landscape context. If there's then, so going back, really far back again in our conversation to the three C's, cause, corridors, and carnivores. There's when you start to idealize, create a little cartoon of that, different types of corridors. So, some of them might be landscape corridors, riparian corridors, mountain corridors, whatever, but some might just be stepping stone corridors where species can move quickly from one stepping stone to a next and get across a landscape which is, otherwise farmed and developed just by, taking those little jumps like you would on a chessboard. And so that's where I think the smaller projects can have a role, is bridging the gaps between the larger core areas where, landscape corridors are just simply not possible, because it's an intensive agricultural land or whatever. Then the small scale stuff can play a really big role there, but it needs to be taken and seen in that wider landscape setting.
What if we looked at it as flyway enrichment? There's another form of connectivity, and it's in the air above our heads, and it's migration routes for species that find it much, much easier to jump from one thing to another. They can fly over the highways, they can fly over the cities, and hopefully they mostly get through without bashing into windows. But they have it better in that way. And what if we were enriching on the ground in little spots here and there? It would be highly important.
I think that's a good example. I mean, mammals can still do those jumps, but obviously for a bird species, it's easier. There are still some barriers to bird migrations, particularly in Europe, where, some people like to shoot small birds, on the migration routes, and they'll wait for them coming and shoot them on migration. So there are still some human barriers there, regardless of the landscape barriers. But I get the point, is that it's easier for bird species than it is perhaps for mammalian species. But then also you got the floristic species as well. They need to be able to shift, particularly as climate changes. They need to shift north south, maybe up and down the mountain. And so connectivity is also important for plants as well as for animals.
Yeah, I was just thinking about a story that Dave Foreman liked to tell about, to kind of put a head on that whole people like to shoot. And other people might think, well, that can't be very successful in any way. But I would bring up the passenger pigeon. And that's exactly how it went from blacking out the sky for hours and even days in the big flocks to nothing, to extinction. And that was precisely and only because of one thing, what you just described. So we are pretty powerful, even when it seems like, that just seems like a hobby, or, we have made it not a hobby before, but an effective extinction machine.
Yeah. And I'm afraid in the UK, there's a very strong, game bird lobby, which has a particular take on things, and they do not, almost to a man, and it's mostly men, do not like rewilding, because it's seen as a force for relinquishing control over habitats and species, which they will profess to be protecting. They're interested in protecting their game birds, but they will use the happy coincidences of other species benefiting from game bird management as a stick to beat the rewilding movement with, saying, hey, look what we're doing.
Yeah, it's always to protect what they are really interested in, and not what they're saying on their brochures. It's never what they're saying on the brochure.
Yeah, so in the UK, we as a nation, the game industry releases 50 plus million game birds a year into the English landscape, the British landscape. And that's a biomass which is greater than all of the other breeding birds put together. It's largely ringneck pheasants and red-legged partridge. I was a bit surprised to find out, actually, from Tom O'Prey, I was mentioning earlier, that there is pheasant shoots in the US as well. So it's not restricted to the UK by any stretch of the imagination.
Yeah, it's really, really hard to get over some cultural things that we adopted hundreds of years ago. They still seem to be going so strong. But at the same time, they seem completely outdated in this new landscape, this new world we find ourselves in. And I think there's some tension there that makes them desperately cloy to this idea that we have to have this. It's a tradition. I don't know. I can't put myself in their heads. I cannot fathom what it's like to be that obsessed with killing birds. But it's something to deal with, and it's something to take seriously, because it is definitely happening, and they are definitely that good at trying to protect their they see as their turf.
Yeah, absolutely.
Well, I wanted to talk a little bit to wrap up here about the future. What are you excited about? Which is a very, very difficult question to ask on this podcast lately, because I never know what I'm going to get from the other side.
Yeah.
But where are the shiny spots that you hold on to, and you remember when you hear bad news, you still got those shiny spots on the map that make you happy, make you proud, and hopeful?
Yeah, I think, well, certainly from a UK context, there are some really interesting projects getting moving. We've got a problem in the UK with, we've got a very truncated biotic pyramid. Our largest mammalian predators, probably a fox or a badger. Our largest avian predator, well, we've reintroduced white-tailed eagles or sea eagles to the UK. We've got killer whales starting to come back, orcas. And so those are all, bright spots. But back to the mammalian predators, we have an overpopulation of deer species because they don't have any natural predators other than ourselves. And that, as a hobby, it's very different from in the US. It's very controlled. You can't just go and take your ticket and shoot a deer and put it in the freezer in the UK. You've got to have access to land and know the right people and to do that. So we don't have that, hunting culture. So, I'm kind of excited by the idea that we might be on the cusp of reintroducing lynx back into the UK. It was so close a few years ago with one of the previous governments. It was almost signed off on until somebody, I can't name names, raised their head and it got quashed. But I think we're close. I'm hopeful before I'm pushing up the daisies that I'll see lynx back in the UK. Wolves, forget it. I quite often say that we're a small island nation with a small island mentality, and even though the UK and Ireland are the only two major European countries without a breeding wolf population, because of our island status, we would have to consciously reintroduce them. And I just don't see that happening. But, the bright spots, as I say, are these great projects involving some, really wonderful and committed people, doing all the good things. But yeah, you're right. There are so many depressing stories. But, rewilding's it's a more optimistic view of nature conservation. And so, I'll keep pushing at that door if you don't mind.
Do you feel thankful that you are part of this area of conservation because it is by definition a hopeful view of possibility and the future? I mean, what would we do if we were out there in any other part of the conservation movement that didn't have, it was always front lines. It's always bad things happening. And it doesn't mean that we're hiding behind it, but it's nice to focus on a topic that has power, that has the ability to really do something, even if it's being completely restricted or somewhat restricted now.
Yeah, I know the old sort of fortress conservation is always sort of fighting a rear guard, conservation areas are shrinking, and although they're growing in number worldwide, a lot of them are just paper parks. And so, you're right. It's quite a depressing sort of view, biodiversity loss and climate change and all the rest of it. But, rewilding has the potential to bend the curve and, change that trajectory, or at least level it out a bit. And so, yeah, I'm immensely proud to have been involved in that at one level, as I say. And I'm got a huge team of people that I owe a lot of gratitude to. And as I say, I mean, somebody had to have their name first. I don't know why it was me. I never put my name forward to do it. But, you know, maybe C, beginning of the alphabet, helps. But
which has been your plan since birth, isn't it? I'm going to put myself at the front of the alphabet.
I would be called Aaron A. Aardvark, to quote the quote copy of 2000 AD comic from many years ago. So immensely proud to have been involved and humbled to have worked with a really great set of people. But yeah, I'm fully aware of the fact that all I've done is draw some maps and write some documents. It's the people who are then utilizing that information and, you know, looking at these guidelines and those guiding principles and going, hey, you know what? This is what we're doing, and this is how we're going to do it. And it's those people who are, you know, kind of doing stuff on the ground. You know, if I was a rich person and I had money, I'd put my money into, you know, doing this on some land that I own, but I'm not. So I'm kind of forced into, you know, providing some of that top level thinking, you know, at a global scale and then down regional and local to help people who do have the resources, the land, the time to do it, to give them a hand.
Well, I'm going to push back on you. You're being far too humble. You, of course, maps are just a way of telling a story about a landscape, and you are probably, I would put at the top of your list of things, a storyteller, a quite good one. And we need people who can communicate these issues and the need and the complexities like you. So you stand out as an example in the world as someone who can do that. And it's too rare right now. And I'm always encouraging people to, you know, think of themselves as people who have stories to tell. The work that you do cannot just be submitted papers and things like that. It has to be to turn around and face the world and go, here's what I've learned. Here's why it's important. And those are all the science communicators, all of the conservation communicators, as few as I think they are. I hope that they're growing, and I hope they use you as an example, one example of how that could be possible and what that might look like for them. So thank you for all your work. And also thank you for taking the time being here today. It was really a good timing. You said the students were having their reading week, so we couldn't have picked a better time.
Absolutely not. Yeah.
Awesome.
Thanks, Jack.
Thank you, Steve.
Appreciate it. And good luck in the future.
Thanks for listening to the Rewilding Earth podcast. We do what we do because of you. This podcast is supported by listeners like you who long to live in a wilder world. Please consider donating at rewilding.org and subscribe to our weekly news and article digest while you're there. To go the extra mile, you can follow and share Rewilding Earth on Instagram, Facebook, and Twitter. Bonus points for sharing this podcast with your friends. To listen to past episodes, go to rewilding.org/pod. That's rewilding.org/pod.